to our webinar, Translation Matters. We're so excited to get into this subject with all of you all. But before we even begin our dialogue, I want to encourage you all to click like, click share, begin to invite your friends, because this is a conversation that I think many people are going to enjoy. So go ahead, click like, click share, start a watch party. Wherever you're watching us from, just chime in and let us know in the comments where you're chiming in from today. Welcome to everyone. As we continue to get set up here, I'm also going to go to my Facebook page and I will do the same thing. So let's just take a minute to do that together as we wait for Dr. Leary to work her magic on her end. This is going to be a very exciting conversation. I don't know what's happening.
If you're on YouTube, go ahead and turn on your notifications, subscribe to our page.
Oh, when did I do this? This is cute. Hello, everyone. Oh, I'm glad I heard that because I also need to make a change here.
Okay.
All right.
So we're about ready to start. We'll allow a few more people to come on in. We're going to try to monitor all of these pages for your comments. So please do, if you have any questions to ask or any comments that you'd like to make, please feel free to make them. Professor Onika, can you monitor the YouTube page for comments? And I can try to also open it on my phone. As you come on in, please press like and share. Follow us on YouTube. Our YouTube is Amana Bible Institute. We're just going to get started in 1 minute.
All right, are we sharing? We're all across our pages, all of our pages.
I think there's just one more page to share from, and it's just our group page. So if you are in our Reflections Dance Company, or if you're on that group, please help us out by sharing. Let me see if I can share it from here. Yes. Actually, I think I shared to the group. Never mind. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. Actually, I think I shared to the group. Never mind. Okay, so today we're going to be starting the last of our Interpretation Matters series up until the end of March of this year, and it's called Translation Matters, #Translation Matters. So I want to start off by just really emphasizing here that what you're going to see a lot of in this small, short learning moment is a lot of information about language and how language works, how language as a mechanism works in culture. One of the things that I want to say right now, which you're going to be seeing kind of over and over, or you're going to kind of see it behind all of the things that you see in the slides that follow, is that language is a social construction, right? We don't necessarily think of it as a social construct because it's something that it's rooted in us. It's something that seems very natural to us, but in reality, society constructs its language, and language changes from society to society. So we're really going to be harping on the importance of understanding language as a cultural enterprise, and why that should set you up as a scholar of the Bible, because we're all scholars, to really dive into the language courses that we have available for you here at ABI. They're really affordable. They're really manageable. We're not expecting you to memorize the entire Hebrew and Greek language or whatnot. We're just really equipping you to be a translator of the text for yourself. And prayerfully, by the end of this webinar, you will be excited and anxious to join us on this journey of furthering our own path to being effective biblical translators. As I mentioned earlier, if you have questions or comments, please feel free to make them in the comment section on Facebook or YouTube. We are definitely here to answer all the questions that you have. So, when we are thinking about the work of translation in itself, one of the things that scholars think about is how do we translate a work? Do we create a translation that is more pure to meaning, or do we choose a translation that's more pure to form? And this is the larger question of how readable do we make a translation? Because in truth, when you make a translation that is true to meaning, it's a lot more readable. Anyone who might not even be skilled in the original language can typically get around what is being communicated. When you make the language true to form, or the translation true to form, it kind of create something that looks really challenging, something really enigmatic, something that sometimes the verbs are out of place, and sometimes it makes it a little hard to follow and to really obtain any type of meaning. The issue, though, is it's the larger question of who gets to decide what things mean. And this is one of the reasons why you should be considering yourself taking a biblical language, learning a biblical language, and learning to be a translator for yourself. Nonetheless, one of the things that come out of this question of how readable a translation should be is, the acknowledgement that languages are really complex things. Word for word translations really don't have clear meanings at all. And finding meaning in text, and this is also just true of life, when you're interpreting and finding meaning in life, you have to realize that it is always relative. Every single time. It is never objective. So it's always subjective. It's always subject to your biases. And in that case, it's important for you to constantly identify the very real reality that you as a translator will never approach a text or approach life period without biases, without your own cultural influences, without your own socioeconomic influences, without the nurturing of your parents, and the ideologies that were embedded in you when you were younger, and the ideologies that you accept as you grow older. Those things are always, in one way or another, going to make themselves present in your work. So a part of these initial questions, we have, as scholars are thinking about translation, they typically think of translation in somewhat three categories, and now the two categories are more larger. So we have this idea that we want to make a translation that sticks closest to the original language. So we want to create a translation that's truest to form on one end of things. These are those really word for word Bibles. They're extremely literal, and sometimes they are the harder biblical translations out there for you to read. They're the ones people rarely want to touch. And then on the other side of things, there are functional translations. These are often thought for thought translations. And then they're typically paraphrases. So, the Voice Bible, the Message Bible, those translations that people feel really, really comfortable grabbing. The New Living Translation. Those are all more so functional Bibles. They are more like paraphrases. And in that case, they're communicating some form of thought, some type of meaning, but they are not true to the form of the Hebrew, Greek, or Aramaic. And that's really important for you to know. Now, what you find in the middle of that is something that is form functional. And these types of translations try to stick as close as it can to the form of the language, but it is also considering its readability. So it wants to be able to communicate some bit of meaning and some bit of thought for thought ideals or whatnot there. Formal translations try, as mentioned, they try to stick as closely to the original form of the text as possible. And I've kind of hinted at this, but the Hebrew Bible or Old Testament is Hebrew, predominantly Hebrew, though there are a few chapters that are in Aramaic. And there are definitely loan words from everywhere, Persian loan words. There's some Babylonian or some ancient Near Eastern linguistic terms in there, but for the most part, Hebrew and some Aramaic. The Greek New Testament is Greek, right? And it's what some people call Koine Greek, which is common Greek in so many ways. And that's probably not the best way to communicate it. It is the Greek that is being communicated among the people, right? It's the Greek being used by the people. And so, and there are many, many different dialects of ancient Greek. Koine Greek is the one that's more common to the popular. It's more popular because it's more common to the people. So formal translations try to stick really close to the original form. Really, you find word for word translations here and extremely literal translations, but they're not quite literal, right? If you want the most literal form of a Bible, you're not going to go to a translation. You're going to go to an interlinear. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a few. But there are problems here. We've already mentioned some of these problems. Language, it's messy. That makes language translation super messy. In addition to this, we have some huge issues. Meaning it varies by culture, and not just by culture, but by time period, right? So what words meant 100 years ago, they do not mean anymore. They don't carry that same connotation anymore, even in the same region, right? So language is temporal, and it's geographical, and it's cultural. And this makes it really, really hard because every culture has these really idiomatic phrases that are just unique to the people who are on the inside, right? And you guys, we're not insiders. I know Christians, we want to be insiders to the text all the time. We think that the Bible was made for us, right? It was made for us to understand, but in truth, it was made with a different type of audience in mind. And we have to be mindful of that, a different type of audience that lived in a different time period and that had very different cultural practices, very different rituals, very different customs, very different ways of thinking and orienting, navigating the world. So in that case, we have to understand that in one way or another, we are outsiders to the people who would have more so readily understood the text. Now, these same people, by the way, would have most likely been hearers of the text, not readers, which brings in a whole nother aspect, a whole nother issue, really. Nonetheless, there are these idiomatic phrases that would be more so understood by ancient audiences. We don't understand those things, and there's only so much understanding we can gather. So, some of these phrases that you might actually understand is bite the bullet. As an American, you hear bite the bullet all the time. You know exactly what it means. Just do it. Do it taking in all the risk, right? Or something like hit the sack. You're not literally hitting a sack. You're going to sleep, right? But if you say these same phrases to someone who's not native to the West, to someone who's not native to even English, they are not going to understand what you're saying. And that's today, you know? But it's because these idioms are not natural to their own culture. So when you're using them with people who would ideally be insiders, right? The thing is, everyone's not an insider, and you have to consider that as you were considering the work of interpretation, whether it's the interpretation of text or whether it is the interpretation of life, right? So I want to give you some great examples of this, and embedded in these examples will be even deeper examples of how inherently biased language is. And it is really important that I really emphasize that language is biased. It is so biased. So we're going to do a trip into the Hebrew Bible or into the Greek New Testament, and we're going to pull out some words there that will prayerfully help you understand this. Please do. The chat functions are here. If you are in the Zoom class and you have a question, feel free to raise your hand. You can even interrupt me. I really don't mind. And ask your question or make your comment. So we have the word ish in Hebrew, right? Ish means man. It also means husband. Many people don't realize that there's a huge connection between the two. Sure, it takes context to know whether to translate the word as man or husband. But the connection, the association between the two potential meanings is that in this culture, the assumption is that if you are a man, you will be a husband, right? It is a gendered way of thinking about the society. It has a lot to do with gender and age in that case, right? The same thing, by the way, happens with the term Isha, which in Hebrew means woman or wife. Also, the connotation there, and this is actually quite clear in Genesis chapter 2, that the woman is called Isha because she comes from an Ish, right? So embedded in the language itself is the idea that women come from men, right? But also, what's there is that when you are a woman, you are expected to be a wife. When you are a man, you are expected to be a husband. This is even more clear with the Greek term parthenos. And by the way, also the Hebrew term for this. It means maiden or young girl. It could also mean virgin. Now, once again, context reveals all. Nonetheless, the language itself is pointing to a societal construction, or a societal ideology, excuse me, that when you are a young girl or a maiden, you are expected to be a virgin, right? We find this also in Isaiah. The Hebrew term is used there. And this is a text we often go to when we're thinking of Isaiah prophesying this birth of Jesus, right? Chapter 7, that this virgin will give birth to a son, right? The term doesn't necessarily mean virgin. just means young girl. A young girl will give birth to a son, a child, right? It's the biases of the translator, and in that case, the choice of the translator to suggest that the young girl would be a virgin. But this is not necessarily the case. And you know this in our society, that all young girls or all young maidens are not, they're not necessarily perceived to be virgins. But this is not necessarily the case in the ancient audience. Lastly, I want to give you the example of the term zonah. We hear this term all the time. In Hebrew, it means prostitute. It also means adulteress. But really, it's a participle from the verb zana, meaning the whoring one, literally. The one who whores. Yeah. So if you think about it that way, doesn't have to be a prostitute. The zonah can just be a wife who is stepping out, you know, or someone perceived to be caught in the art of adultery. And the idea is often that this whoring one would be female, which is also another aspect of this term. It is a very gendered term, even though technically it's a noun that has verbal aspects, right? It's a participle, right? And so they have gendered connotations typically, but that is determined by the language itself and by endings or suffixes, right? But in this case, we commonly see the term zonah and we are instantly thinking women. Says a lot about the culture. There are also some tougher things to think about when you're reading the Bible, and this is also in the English. For example, in Jeremiah 1, and I've mentioned this example many times in webinars in the past, Jeremiah 1, there's a vision report there. God says, "What do you see, Jeremiah?" Jeremiah says, "I see the branch of an almond tree," right? The idea is, you know, that Jeremiah would be able to report what he is seeing, and there would be some type of sense in or connection between what Jeremiah is seeing and what the prophetic word is. But if you read it in the English, it makes no sense. I see the branch of an almond tree. God says, "Yes, you've seen right. I will watch over my word to perform it." Yeah, the English translator should think to him or herself, wait a minute, where's the association there? And in truth, you will not find the association until you look in the Hebrew. And this takes, you know, a little bit of a trained eye. You have to look at the vowels in Hebrew, and the vowels are actually weird little symbols, often above or below the letter, the consonant, which is a little bit harder to know unless you take Bible language tools or a Hebrew course with us, the Hebrew primer course with us. But it's actually the writer playing with the language, right? The word for almond tree is shoched. The word for watch, the verb for watch is shachad. So really just playing with the language here to produce meaning. There's another example here in Amos chapter 8, where the summer fruit is supposed to represent an end. That doesn't exist in our culture. Summer fruit does not represent an end in our culture. But in this case, it's a play on of words. It's kayets versus kets. And this is actually meant to be somewhat of a auditory quip. These people are supposed to be hearing this in Hebrew, and they're supposed to be making the connection because the two words sound alike, right? So just to move on a little bit, because I've been here for a really long time, many of these literal translations are really hard to understand because they are often really shrouded in meaning. Though this is not always the case with every single thing in the Bible, there's some really simple Hebrew in the Bible as well, though even that requires some really, deep thought when it comes to translation. It's often the case that literal translations do not get rid of, they don't actually produce clear meanings all the time. And sometimes there's nothing you can do outside of a textual note to make it clear, like in the case of Jeremiah 1 or Amos chapter 8. And also, what this teaches us is that there is no textual translation that is truly literal throughout. This is because you'd end up with a source that is unreadable, which is kind of like what you find in an interlinear. And I believe I have an example of that a little later. Functional translations, this is the other side of things. They're also called dynamic translations. They're there to help you read, right? So instead of being translated meaning word by word, it's translated by meaning. The problem is, and I hinted at this earlier, who determines what things mean? Who makes meaning valid? So there's an Italian phrase, traditore. It means the translator is a traitor, and yes, he or she absolutely is. We're all traitors, yes, because no translation is without its biases, none. And making text readable, it often requires removing ambiguity present in the text. You should not see that reference that says find example using the Bible. But if you're interested in one, I'm happy to email you one. And the translator's purpose or agenda or interpretation is always going to be central. So this is another thing that students learn here with in Amana Bible Institute. We teach you the difference between exegesis and eisegesis, and no, eisegesis reading into the text is not bad. It's just the thing that you should not do until you've done proper exegesis, which means that you are allowing the text to reveal its meaning to you. You are coming to the text as a blank slate, not with your own cultural ideologies, not telling the text what it has to say, and you're just letting the voice of the text itself speak to you, right? So we want to teach you how to do that process first, and then we can free you to do the work of eisegesis. And we can trust that you can do eisegesis more responsibly. So it's really important to first think about your intentions when you are approaching a text. And this isn't just for the translator, it is especially true for the interpreter as well. Translators can also easily live into this tradition of the scribes, right? So scribes in the ancient world, not as ancient as the Hebrew Bible, but around the time of Jesus, really, and a little before, they were rabbis. They came into this school-like setting, and they really just chatted about texts, right? They played with the language. They took notes from one another's traditions, from the traditions of their teachers, and they worked on making scripture relevant to their time and for their parishioners, right? It's kind of what Amana wants to create a classroom of, people who are able to kind of do that work. The problem is, when this work happens, sometimes these meanings are kind of just simply based off of tradition of readings, which kind of is the situation that the body of Christ is in right now. Sometimes, theological education is less important because grandpa, he translated the text like this, right? Now, the other issue that's at hand here is the actual scribes who gave us manuscripts, copies of the original Hebrew, or copies of these documents with these texts on it, lots of them would have gone through the text. They would have not only made unintentional errors, which we talk about in Bible language tools. So if you're interested in those, do take that class. But they also made intentional errors. There would have been, or variants. They would have thought while they were translating or writing the text, they would have thought, wait, I don't remember it that way. I remember it this way. Or wait a minute, I think this word is spelled wrong. I don't think it's supposed to be is. I think it was supposed to be was, right? Or wait a minute, 3 verses ago, it said that this person went to location B. So it can't say that this person is somewhere else. Let's harmonize the text, right? Or sometimes they looked at multiple manuscripts that read somewhat differently and made a way to harmonize them to create one, right? When we are doing the work of translation and we are not checking our purpose, our intentions, our agenda, we can very easily walk into the same tradition of translating text with what we with by what we remember, by our own ideologies, by changing things that we think doesn't present God in favorable ways. And you guys, this has been happening for a really long time. A lot of people talk about things that are being removed out of the Bible now, but there are different types of Bibles. There was a Bible for Black people during the time of slavery. That Bible had in it, or it had taken out of it, all of these texts that were related to freedom and liberty, right? So there was no Exodus account there, right? There were no accounts relating or regarding God's law concerning the manumission of slaves. There were just texts there that really just emphasized obedience and the need for slaves to remain slaves, right? This has been going on for a really long time. There have always been multiple Bibles out there and multiple translations that have certain corrections, certain variances, and it is the work of the translator. That is the job of the translator in so many ways. One of the jobs of some translators to do that type of work, to create a text that works for their audience. But also it sometimes is the work of the interpreter. So it is really important that we do not try to harmonize tension, but that we translate the text as it is provided to us, and that we find ways to work through the tension, because life is full of tension and God is in all of the tension. God is in the gray, not the black and white. I hope I made that kind of clear. So very long tangent to get to that point. So what often ends up happening in some of the translations I recommend, which I will show you on the next slide, on the slide after, fit within this category. The middle ground type of translation is what I call a form functional translation. And yes.
So I have a question. Before you go into telling us a little bit about how we remedy this as biblical scholars, but for the person who might be asking, well, okay, you're talking about all these variances within the text and how the scribe or the interpreter is central in terms of the interpretation process and stuff like that. How do you reconcile this idea about the inspiration of the text and the inerrancy of the text that some people believe in and that kind of stuff? How would you respond to an inquirer's question as it relates to the integrity of what we have and whether or not it is really the inspired word of God?
That's a great question. And I get this question a lot in my classes. My go-to answer is that the student has to arm his or herself with every bit of knowledge that he or she can arm him or herself with, right? To empower themselves to adequately translate or interpret text, right? utilize your resources. And it's not just, knowledge that you get from books and language itself, but it's also culture. It's also the people around you. And of course, your own personal relationship with God. Everyone's going to reconcile with the tensions of the text on their own. And I can't tell people how to do that for themselves. But what helps me is realizing that the Bible is the book of culture. The Bible is a cultural tool. And if you remember that, you're golden. The Bible is definitely written by fallible people. And even if you want to use Timothy and really keep at the forefront that God is inspiring the words of the Bible, you still cannot evade the reality that God's word are placed in fallible beings. And then the work of God is in giving us the grace to do the work of translation, to do the work of interpretation, and to not stop doing it, because the Bible is, in order to keep the words, any type of words active, you have to keep engaging them. The Bible will lose its relevance if there aren't interpreters who's making it relevant, right? So I think when you think about it that way, it helps. Another thing that helps me is I often think of the Bible as a book, as a text that records history of perspectives of God. You can find 2 or 3 perspectives of God in one chapter, and thousands in one entire book. So if you are pursuing the text and interpretation of the text as this exploration of God, what you're going to find is that everyone finds God in their own place, thinks of God in their own ways, lives out their beliefs concerning God in their own ways, and that it's okay. The Bible compilers, the Hebrew Bible compilers, they understood that these texts said something different, and they were okay with it, and it was still sacred to them. So we have to find a way to understand that history in itself and the freedom to learn about God, the freedom to embrace God personally is sacred. That's where the sacredness of the text is in, not in all the tensions that's there. Well, you can see it in the tensions as well, because life is full of tension. And what better way to find God than in times of tension? I hope that kind of answers your question.
Absolutely, it does. And I like what you said about it giving us the grace to continue to explore God, right? Just by having these tensions, it allows us to, like you said, keep the word active, to keep us engaged with this word, and to keep making it relevant, or to keep representing its relevance to our contemporary, to our context. And I think that's in one aspect that helps to remind us that this is a living word, right? It's a living thing. So I like that approach, because a lot of people love to center on the finiteness of the word and of this text that we have, and they don't see that it's alive and it's breathing. The whole thought about something being inspired, for me, it kind of stirs up the idea of it being formed and reformed, and that the creative process is ongoing, especially since we're still living out this particular reality. So I like that. I like that expression. I like that response in terms of how we view the word. So go ahead. Thank you.
No, thank you for the question. I think we often think about, we think we're afraid to ask questions of the Bible and of God, right? So then everything that we view as sacred becomes the thing that we are afraid to touch. We're afraid to tamper with, we're afraid to engage. But in truth, you only really find God, and you only really find any bit of true sustenance and life in the text if you're willing to engage it. Like, you have to ask it questions, you have to interrogate it, you have to deal with the tensions, not avoid the tensions. You have to identify that the God of Joshua is genocidal. Like, you have to identify these things and then figure out, how do I approach the text? What do I do with this? Why is it this way? Why are these people seeing their God this way, right? Like, this has to be the thing that we're not afraid to do. Like, the sacred needs to be touched. There are just certain ways that you have to touch the sacred.
Yeah, I agree. And I think it's a way, I think it's one way, how would I say it? One way that that God even partners with us. I think that's where the relationship between deity and us, that how that's formed and how that's developed through that tension. Because I mean, within ourselves as human beings and finite as we are, we go through tensions all day long. But we as we continue to learn and to grow, we evolve, right? And we come into better relationship with ourselves and of course with other people, etc. So, and this thing that God has given to us in the form of this text is kind of like one of the same things, our engaging with the word and engaging with God and growing a relationship. So I love that these tensions, these so-called variances, as we're identifying some of them, that they give us the permission to tread these kinds of waters. But don't let me take up too much of your time. I'm taking away from the rest of your presentation. Go ahead.
Supposed to be co-teaching here. I'm totally okay with this. And totally okay if there are questions out there on YouTube or questions here on Zoom or Facebook. So please do ask your questions, make your comments. We're definitely here to answer them, or to read them aloud in the live class. So the middle ground between form translations and functional translations is what I call form functional translations. These translations, to me, are the most fun and the most effective to read because they're not paraphrases. They try to stick very close to the form of the text, so word for word. But when word for word meaning is most unclear, they try to translate for meaning. And the results of this, and sure, there are problems with all translations, right? Because language is messy. But the result of this is pretty much a readable translation that can make sense to the elite. And what I mean by the elite is I mean the educationally elite, those who can read the text in its original language, and those who can't, right? It's a good middle ground. And no, the KJV does not fit within this technically. So what this teaches us is that translations fit on a spectrum, right? From word to word to thought for thought. The endpoints of these spectrums, though, of this spectrum, they are not translations at all, right? On the far left side of this spectrum where you find form translations, there are very, very literal texts called interlinears, which you see here in this picture on the left, pretty much provides to you the biblical language. In the first line, in this case, this is the gospel according to John. So we find Greek in the first line. And then right under each and every word, you find an acceptable English translation. Now it's under the word, so you still got to make sense out of it, right? You still got to try to do the work of putting these words together. But it's fairly literal for that reason. And on the right side of the spectrum, you have what we call paraphrases, which are not translations, you guys. The Message Bible is not a translation. It will tell you when you read the first few pages of the front matter that it is a paraphrase. That's why the text sounds so normal. It sounds like everyday English because it is not a translation. It is a paraphrase, and it is just there to communicate to you what the translator believes the meaning to be, right? And paraphrases are just often way too loose to be considered translations, in my opinion. They're not bad. I want to make that really clear. They are not bad. But if you want to effectively study the text, you can't just be reading a paraphrase. You need to be able to have a little bit of everything out in front of you, something literal, something in the middle, and something that's a lot more flexible, right? That's the most effective way to really do the work of translation or interpretation, excuse me, if you're not quite skilled at being a translator. And even if you are skilled at being a translator, it's not a bad idea to have 4 or 5 different texts in front of you. So I'll reiterate this. This spectrum is from form, literal, word for word, to form functional, which is middle ground, word for word, thought for thought, and then to functional, thought for thought, often paraphrases. And I've given you a chart here that I created myself. It is a part of my translation chapter. And if you would like that chapter, I am happy to provide it to you free of charge. Though the manual will be coming out and used for the Bible language tools course offered, I believe, in April, and you can purchase the manual then. So I provided for you in this chart form translation, starting with the very, very literal interlinear, and then all the way at the right, paraphrases, ending with something like the Message, the Living Bible, the New Living Translation, and right there in the middle where you find the greenish, bluish, more so green blue color is the form functional. And you have here some of the texts that I actually will recommend. The preferred Bible for Amana Bible Institute is the NRSV, which is the New Revised Standard Version. It is a translation that most scholars use, and it is extremely readable. And they're great study Bibles that's based on this translation, and you can find it free on Bible Gateway. So, really great tool there. Lastly, I want to ask the question, how do we get beyond this, right? The thing that you must not do is be okay with some other translator doing the translation work for you and doing the interpretive work for you, right? This is how you do that. You read and study multiple translations of the Bible. You ask questions. You learn about the world that produced biblical text, because context does matter. And if you want to learn how to do those things, take Bible language tools. We teach you that stuff. You work with the biblical language as best as you can by doing word studies. We'll teach you how to do that in Bible language tools. And we'll teach you how to use free language tools like lexicons and concordances to guide you along the way. The problem is, like most language tools, language is biased, right? Culture is biased. Concordances are super biased. They are only based upon one specific translation of the Bible, but they're not bad tools, you guys. You just need to learn how to effectively use them, and we'll teach you how to do that. And last but not least, you learn biblical languages for yourself, and you come to the table and be willing to do the work of wrestling with the job of translation for yourself. It is challenging, but it is fun and rewarding, and it's not hard, right? Might be hard at first as you're getting through your head the idea, the meanings of this weird alphabet that you see on the right here. This is Hebrew. But it's once you get your mind through the symbols, it's really not that bad, you guys. I promise. And we will take our time and teach you the language. Our language courses are done in 2 semesters, but we start the language courses off with a 1-semester course that's called a biblical language primer. And that course will teach you the alphabet in Greek, the alphabet for Hebrew and Greek, and it'll also help you understand the mechanics of language so that you can go into the language course of your choice, whether Hebrew or Greek or both, depending on what you want to do, as successful as possible. And by the way, the primer course is just 4 weeks. It's a $60 course, but when you enroll in your language course, whether Hebrew or Greek, we will push that $60 over into your language course. So you'll end up only paying $60 for your language course, which is 8 weeks, instead of $120. So you do get your language course half off just by taking the primer course, which technically makes it free. So do take the primer. We're offering it in February. The only other thing I want to say before I ask if there are questions or comments is the thing that you guys have to also realize that I don't say enough actually is, translation and interpretation is so very cultural that you can't just simply think that it is based upon education or socioeconomic class. It also has a lot to do with race and gender, right? There are meanings in text that you will never get until you are able to translate the text yourself, coming from a very different socioeconomic background, different race, different gender. Like, there are things that you will be sensitive to as a translator that the white elite male will not be. And most translators are white men. So we need more Black folk translating text, and we need women translating text so that we can unearth a lot of these silenced voices. And the only way that's going to happen is if we can get you guys to come to the table and challenge yourself to do the work. And we also need more people who are interested in the religious life translating text, right? Because we do get a lot of scholars who are interested in just the pure academics translating text. And that's great for me. But that would just essentially mean that the commentary I write might not appeal to you. So, be a translator. Questions, comments, concerns? We do have something on Facebook. Is the Strong's Concordance one of the final tools to be used when interpreting the scriptures? I wouldn't say final. It is a tool that you could use to help you. The problem with Strong's is, it's a concordance. There are typically two types of Strong's. There's the one that's based upon the NIV version and one that's based upon the KJV version, so the New International Version, and then the King James version of the Bible. And what concordances do is they look at the Hebrew or Greek, and then they look at the King James version or the NIV, and they give you the word that version of the Bible uses or correlates with that Hebrew or Greek term, right? And one thing that I didn't discuss here, that I more so discussed in language classes, is there are different types of manuscripts. They don't all say the same type of things, use the same type of words, and some of them are a little newer than others. So the Textus Receptus, for example, which was one of the earlier translations or manuscripts utilized to give us an English translation. It's what the KJV used in 1609, I believe, is actually a newer type of manuscript compared to other Hebrew manuscripts. And you can tell the difference because there are expansions in the Textus Receptus that are not there in other Hebrew manuscripts. Sometimes there are differences in words. There are different Hebrew terms used. And so this becomes a whole nother, can of worms with the job of translation. What you find in the KJV might differ from what you find in the NRSV because they're using different manuscripts. So I hope that makes sense, Miss Felicia. It's a good tool, but it should not be your sole tool or your final tool. More questions, comments, anything on YouTube?
No, I don't see anything on YouTube right now.
Okay. Any comments or questions on Zoom?
One of our attendees was just saying that this was a very rich lesson, and they were saying thank you.
Oh, no problem. Thank you for coming. And I'll send this PowerPoint out to you via email. And if you are out there in Facebook or on YouTube, even if you're watching the replay and you would like this PowerPoint, I am happy to send it to you. If you would like the chapter on translation, I am happy to send that as well. So I've provided in this PowerPoint a few tools for you, a few resources. And I just want to complete this webinar with just a few of our offerings this spring. We started classes this week, so really excited about that. Term 1A courses include and these are just the courses that that are still open. First off, I want to say Gospel Parables, because that course is actually going to close in a few minutes. So if you want to register for that course, go online right now, register before the end of the night. Professor Onika here, who's on the line, she is the instructor for that course, and I'm sure it's going to be phenomenal because she is a phenomenal teacher. Prophetic Artistry 101. I am teaching that course. It starts this Thursday at 7 p.m. It's going to be fun. We are going to talk about how to utilize our art forms for our own personal healing in 101. And then in the next semester, which will most likely be the summer, we're going to talk about how to utilize our art forms to deliver messages to our targeted audience. So it's going to be a really fun course. It's not just for those in the performing arts, but those in the visual arts, and also those who are creative writers or prophetic writers. Come. It's going to be fun. And the course really just hinges on identity, how you see you, how God sees you, how you produce what God sees, that kind of thing. So should be fun. It starts Thursday at 7. So you would need to register between now and Thursday in order to get into that course. And last but not least, we are teaching Introduction to Old Testament Torah. I'm also teaching that course. It starts Saturday at 11 o'clock. It is an 8-week course, so it starts this week, but it ends in March. And it's going to be fun. We're going to talk about the Hebrew Bible, Old Testament. It's just the first 5 books of the Bible. And we're going to talk about why it's relevant for this time right now, because the Bible is extremely relevant. And there are probably very few texts in the Bible that are as relevant as the Old Testament today. Lots of people segue into the New Testament for life today, but the Old Testament is full of really amazing texts and legislation that can be very helpful in a divided nation as we are living in today. So do think about registering for that class. You will need to register by Saturday at 11 a.m. to join. I also want to invite you to register for Term 2 classes. These classes will start in the middle of February, around Valentine's Day. We have social entrepreneurship that Professor Cameron will be teaching. It's going to be Saturdays at 10 a.m. We have Biblical Languages Primer, which Onika and I will be teaching. It's going to be great. And in so many ways, this course acts as a great, this webinar acts as a great primer for you to kind of help you understand why the primer course will be important. And the primer course is going to, give you all the tools that you need to effectively learn a biblical language, or both. We do have a biblical language certificate. And last but not least, in Term 2, we're offering Bible Sex and Other Texts. It's going to be so fun. We're going to talk about in Part 1, ancient Near Eastern texts. So we're going to read the Bible, but we're also going to be reading some other texts from the ancient Near Eastern world. And these texts might have influenced some of what we read in the Bible. And yes, some of these texts are real scandalous. So it's going to be super fun. It's a 4-week course that will be Thursdays at 7. And part 2 will be in term 3, so in March. We do have some promotions for you, so please do go on our website and learn about the ways in which you can get discounts for those courses, like monthly subscriptions, which are all 10% off, and certificate programs, which are 20% off. And if you do register for a Christian ministry certificate program and you start courses this week, you can get that certificate by the end of the spring semester, which will conclude in May. So you can actually have a certificate by the end of the spring. So do that, and it's 20% off. And I've already mentioned this earlier, 50% off of the biblical language for taking the primers course, which will start in February. Last but not least, webinars. Come back to us. We will be offering some really amazing webinars that are all about you and for you. And I'm just going to leave these here on the screen and allow you guys to read what we have coming up for you. If you register for the webinars, you will be permitted a link that will allow you access into the Zoom session. The Zoom session is the best way to do the webinars, in my opinion. You're in the session, you can ask questions, you can give your comments, you can help drive the sessions. And we want you to help drive the session so that you don't have to do or hear me do what I did today, just kind of lecture you. I don't like to lecture. So I prefer the discussion. So come be my discussion partner and help us out here. If you want to register, go ahead and go to our website, www.amadabibleinstitute.net, and just click on the button that says register for webinars. Any questions or comments before we conclude the webinar tonight? Okay, well, if no questions or comments, I hope you guys have a great day, and I hope to see you at the end of the month when we discuss spiritual formation. Have a nice day, you guys.